There is a federal report filed in 1863 that almost nobody talks about. It isn't a fringe document. It isn't something passed around in alternative history circles. It was written by a government geologist named Charles Whittlesey, submitted through official federal channels, and then quietly filed into the archive where inconvenient findings tend to end up. Discussed once, referenced rarely, forgotten almost entirely. What Whittlesey documented was not a theory. It was a physical reality sitting in the ground across the upper peninsula of Michigan, one that professional mining engineers had already encountered in the 1840s and could not explain. And the explanation they couldn't find has not been found since. In the 1840s, American mining companies moved into the Lake Superior region expecting to find untouched copper. The surveys had confirmed it was there, not ore requiring industrial processing to release, pure native copper, metallic, ready, sitting in the earth in nuggets, in sheets, in masses so large that single pieces weighed thousands of pounds. The companies moved in with their engineers, their equipment, their capital, and then they stopped. Not because the copper wasn't there, because someone had already taken it. The mines were everywhere, not one or two, thousands. Pit excavations dug 30, 40, 60 feet into the earth across the Keweenaw Peninsula, across Isle Royale, along the shores of Lake Superior, stretching into Wisconsin and Minnesota. Tunnels driven into rock faces, drainage channels cut at precise angles to pull groundwater away from the shafts before it could flood them. Wooden support platforms still wedged into walls so ancient the timber had begun dissolving back into soil. And the tools? Stone hammers left exactly where workers had set them down, hundreds at a single site, some weighing 10 pounds, some weighing 40. Sized for specific tasks, the way a modern construction site carries different equipment for different stages of work. The engineers walked from site to site across hundreds of miles, the same thing everywhere, organised, systematic, deliberate. This was not people picking up loose copper along a riverbank. This was an industrial operation, abandoned so long ago that full-grown trees had taken root inside some of the open pits. Root systems had pushed through shaft walls. In certain locations, the only evidence was a change in soil and stone hammers that didn't belong to any culture anyone could identify. The dating came later. 20th century archaeologists extracted timber from the ancient shaft supports and sent it for radiocarbon analysis. The results were difficult to absorb calmly. 3,000 years old, 4,500 years old, 5,500 years old, 5,500 years ago. The pyramids had not yet been built. Rome did not exist, would not exist for another 4,000 years. And someone was operating a precision copper extraction network in Michigan. Not digging, not gathering, operating, with drainage systems, tiered shafts, and a technique so advanced it carried a name when European archaeologists later found it in the ancient mines of Sinai in Greece. Fire setting. You build a fire against the rock face, heat the stone to temperature, then pour cold water over it. The thermal shock fractures the rock from the inside, splitting it along stress lines, exposing the copper underneath. You do not stumble onto this. You arrive at it through generations of accumulated knowledge, through failures and refinements passed down long enough that the technique becomes instinct. The evidence is still in those shaft walls, burned surfaces, ash layers, fracture patterns that only thermal shock produces, identical to what archaeologists found in the ancient mines of the old world, on the other side of an ocean, now the number. Whittlesey's estimate for the total copper removed by these ancient miners between 1.5 billion and 2 billion pounds. Modern researchers debate the methodology. The most conservative academic figure is 500 million pounds. Take that number. 500 million pounds of pure native copper, extracted, processed, removed before a single European reached this continent, before Columbus, before Rome fell, before Rome existed. Where did it go? The pre-Columbian archaeological record of North America contains copper artifacts, ceremonial objects, burial goods, trade ornaments documented across the continent. Real, significant, carefully studied, and nowhere near £500 million. Not close, not a fraction. The copper proven by physical evidence, by dated timbers, by thousands of coordinated extraction sites, did not stay on this continent in any form archaeology can account for. It went somewhere. And for more than a century and a half, and that somewhere has had no answer. This is where most investigations stop. But there was something else in the archive. Not a geological report, not an engineering survey. Something recorded in 1894, mind, by the people who had been standing on that land, watching those mines go silent, long before any federal surveyor arrived to measure what was missing. And what they remembered was not about the copper. It was about the people who came to take it. £500 million. That number needs to sit for a moment before we move forward, because the scale of it is not something the mind absorbs naturally. £500 million of extracted copper is not a historical curiosity. It is not an anomaly that fits quietly into existing frameworks. It is a problem. A real documented, unresolved problem that serious researchers have been circling for over a century without landing on an answer that fully holds. And the problem has two sides. The first side is the mines themselves, which we have already established are real, dated, and undeniable. The second side is what should exist because of those mines, and doesn't. Here is what the archaeological record of prehistoric North America actually shows. Copper artifacts exist. They have been documented at hundreds of sites across the continent. The Hopewell culture of the Ohio Valley, active roughly 2,000 years ago, produced copper ornaments of genuine craftsmanship, copper headpieces, copper breastplates, copper cut into geometric shapes and sewn into burial garments. The Mississippian cultures that followed produced copper ceremonial objects found as far south as Georgia and Alabama. Real copper work, skilled copper work. But here is what the volume of that work actually represents when you total it across every documented pre-Columbian site on the continent. Thousands of pounds, tens of thousands of pounds at the very outside edge of generous estimation. Not millions, not hundreds of millions. The gap between what was extracted from Lake Superior and what appears in the North American archaeological record is not a rounding error. It is not a gap that better fieldwork will close. It is a canyon. And a canyon of that size means one thing. The copper left. Now ask the harder question. How? £500 million of raw copper does not move by accident. It does not drift across a continent through casual trade networks, passing a nugget here and an ingot there across generations until it simply disappears into the archaeological noise. The logistics of moving that volume of material require vessels, large vessels, vessels capable of carrying significant cargo weight across open water, because Lake Superior itself is not a gentle body of water. It is 600 miles long. It produces waves that have sunk modern steel freighters. Moving copper out of the Lake Superior region in meaningful quantity means navigating that lake first, and then navigating whatever came after it. Which means whoever was doing this had marine engineering capability. Not canoes, not rafts. Purpose-built cargo vessels operated by people who understood open water the way a professional mariner understands it, through long experience, through generational knowledge of currents and weather and load management on rough seas. This is where a separate problem enters the story. One that has been quietly troubling European researchers for decades. The European Bronze Age runs from roughly 3,300 BCE to 1,200 BCE. Bronze is an alloy of copper and tin. To produce bronze at the scale the European Bronze Age actually operated, the swords, the shields, the tools, the vessels, the ornaments pulled from Bronze Age sites from Scandinavia to the Aegean, you need copper. Enormous quantities of copper. And here is the problem European archaeologists have never fully resolved. The known copper deposits of Europe cannot account for it. Britain has copper deposits. Cyprus has copper deposits. The Alpine region has copper deposits. But the quantity demanded by the Bronze Age substantially exceeds what those sources could have supplied. This is not a fringe claim. It is a documented supply problem sitting inside mainstream archaeological literature, acknowledged, discussed, and unresolved. Then a new tool entered the investigation: isotopic fingerprinting. Copper from different geological sources carries a distinct chemical signature, a ratio of isotopes locked into the metal at formation that survives smelting, working, and thousands of years of burial. Researchers applied this to Bronze Age copper artifacts from European sites. Some returned signatures that matched no known European source, signatures that matched Lake Superior copper with a precision that made certain researchers stop and look again. The methodology is contested. Not every researcher accepts it, but the signatures exist, the data exists, and the supply problem has not gone away. If you hold the extraction evidence, the isotopic data, and the Bronze Age supply problem together, what emerges is something the conventional timeline was not designed to accommodate. Someone was moving copper from North America to the Old World, not occasionally, not accidentally, systematically, continuously, across centuries, without leaving a clear record in any archive mainstream history has been willing to read as what it appears to be. But one archive recorded something, not the copper, not the ships, the memory of the people who watched it happen from the shore. In 1894, a researcher sat down with Ojibwe elders and recorded what their oral tradition had preserved. Published through the Wisconsin State Historical Society, a legitimate institutional publication. What the elders described was not mythology, it was an account of a physical people who came with one purpose, extracted what they came for, and left. They called them the Copper People, arriving from across the Great Water to the east, organized, purposeful, knowing exactly where the copper was. What makes the testimony significant is not any single detail. It is how precisely those details align with physical evidence established before any elder was ever asked a question. The Ojibwe described fire used against the rock face to break it apart. Fire setting, the exact technique archaeologists had already independently identified in the shaft walls. They described organized groups moving between sites, matching the systematic distribution of mine workings across the landscape. They described copper moved to the water's edge and loaded onto vessels, matching archaeological concentrations of copper debris near shorelines, two independent lines of evidence arriving at the same description through entirely separate paths. The elders were consistent on the ending: no war, no plague, no disaster. The operation stopped. The people departed in the direction they had come from. One elder described it simply: when the Copper People left, the lake went quiet. Not the land, not the forest, the lake, because the lake was what those people had used as a highway, as a loading dock, as the last connection between this landscape and wherever they were going. When the vessels stopped coming, the silence was specific enough that the people left behind noticed exactly where it had come from. That is not mythology. That is the testimony of a witness, preserved across thousands of years and handed to a researcher in 1894 who wrote it down and filed it away. It has been sitting in that archive ever since, waiting for someone willing to hold it against the physical evidence and argue what the two together are actually telling us. The mines are still there. You can visit them today. The ancient pit workings of the Keweenaw Peninsula, Isle Royale, the stone hammers sitting in museum cases, the shaft timber that has been dated, the burned rock walls that still carry the signature of fire setting. The physical evidence was never hidden. It was documented, studied, and then quietly placed into a category that mainstream archaeology has never been fully comfortable with, because following it seriously leads somewhere the conventional timeline was not built to go. The 1894 testimony was not suppressed in any dramatic sense. Nobody seized it. Nobody classified it. It was published, filed, and then simply not followed up. which in many ways is more effective than suppression. Active suppression creates questions. Neglect just lets things disappear. Research priorities shifted. Institutional archaeology in the early 20th century was focused on establishing itself as a rigorous science, and any evidence pointing toward pre-Columbian contact across the Atlantic was quietly set aside to protect a paradigm that had already hardened into something close to a rule. But the evidence did not disappear. The mines are real. The extraction volume is real. The dating is real. The missing copper is real. The Bronze Age supply problem is real. The isotopic signatures are real. The Ojibwe testimony recorded in 1894 is real. Each one of those things is documented. Each one of them points in the same direction. And none of them have been satisfactorily explained by the framework we currently use to understand the ancient world. The Ojibwe held that memory for 3,000 years. They handed it over in 1894 to someone who wrote it down. It is still there. The question is not whether the evidence exists. The question is whether anyone is willing to follow it all the way to wherever it actually leads.